From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with audio communication.
Hi and welcome to episode 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This podcast series is all about exploring the huge opportunities offered by podcasts, in particular to companies looking to engage with their audience and grow their brand. We talk to the most influential podcast experts around. Coming up on this episode, we examine 2 well-known and successful independent podcasters and how they're making money. And as I welcome my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore, it's not necessarily easy, is it? But as they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Hi Nick, no, there certainly isn't. It takes time and much effort to build a community. And here's the clincher. They say you've got to work out how to make people want to pay for your content. That's where the serious money comes in, at least it has for our guests this episode. Ben Grundy and Aaron Wright work full-time on their phenomenally successful Mysterious Universe. They're passionate about their craft and they're serious about the business side of podcasting.
I think it's vitally important when it comes to charging for your podcast and making money out of it. It's like any business. You've got to put a lot of that money back into the company. This is how Ben and I have managed to try and stay ahead of the curve.
We'll hear from Ben Grundy and Aaron Wright shortly. But before we get to the specifics of how our guests today are making money through paid content, it's important to mention that there are a number of other ways podcasters are making money, and some are making a significant income. There are also many opportunities for brands to get a good return on investment by being involved in podcasts. But we'll revisit this through case studies in future episodes. For now, let's hear how our guests are making a living. And Chris, you caught up with another long-time Australian podcaster.
Yes, he's been described as the doyen of Australian podcasting. Brisbane-based Cameron Reilly, who way back in 2004 co-founded TPN, or the Podcast Network. Over the years, Cameron and his partner in crime, Ray Harris from Virginia in the USA, have created several podcasts, and probably most well known is Life of Caesar, an entertaining, over-the-top weekly portrayal of Julius Caesar. Other historical podcasts include Life of Augustus Caesar, Life of Alexander the Great, and A Cold War. Cameron tells me how he found the path to making money was by tapping into a loyal and engaged community.
There are 2 basic models. One is advertising, the other is selling subscriptions and or access to premium content. I guess the third you could say is more of a crowdfunding approach, but let me break them down one by one. Advertising on podcasts is really something that you're only going to make any reasonable money out of if you're one of the top 1 or 2% of podcasts in the world. And that's normally something that you have to either be a celebrity before you start a podcast, or, it's a podcast which is a spin-off of a radio show or a television show or something like that. According to Rob Walsh, who's one of the guys behind Libsyn, which is the biggest podcast hosting company, I think, on the planet, very, very, very few podcasts are big enough to make any serious money out of advertising.
Will that change, do you think?
Oh, sure, maybe if advertisers change what they're looking for. But, the problem with advertising, and we found this a decade ago with the Podcast Network in its original run, the problem with, so there's a couple of things. First of all, podcasts tend to have a global audience. I sit in Brisbane, produce my shows, about 65% of my audience is always coming out of the US. And then we've got another sort of 20% that's Australia, and then UK, Canada, and a smattering of other countries. Now, the problem with selling advertising on a global basis is if you go and approach an agency in Australia or the marketing director of a company in Australia, their remit is to reach a domestic audience. They don't really care about reaching the US. You go and talk to somebody in the US, their remit is to maybe reach North America. They don't care about the rest of the world. So in order to get a global ad deal, you've got to be dealing with different marketing directors or agencies in different parts of the globe. But also they're usually looking for large reach. Now, if you have a podcast that is very niche but has a highly profitable audience, one of the most profitable shows we had back in the early days was one on digital photography. We made a lot of money out of that for a couple of years. Companies that had software for manipulating digital photographs or lenses or cameras wanted to reach this small but niche, and they figured potentially highly profitable audience. But most advertisers don't think in terms yet of reaching small but highly influential pockets of audience. They just want to reach big numbers. So, I don't think podcasting is going to change to the extent where your average podcast is reaching 1 million people an episode.
But you probably don't care so much about the advertising because your business model is behind, or some of it is behind a paywall, the free plus premium offerings. Is that the best way or the only way to go about making money?
I certainly think it's the best way for the majority of, let's say, amateur podcasters, people that don't already have a big brand, aren't already a celebrity. Simply because you don't need huge numbers to make a reasonable amount of money. I believe in Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans business model for artists. Are you familiar with that?
Enlighten me.
Yeah, Kevin Kelly was, I think, the founding editor-in-chief of Wired magazine back in the day, and he's sort of a tech futurist who probably a decade ago wrote a manifesto on this idea of 1,000 true fans. He said, look, the business model in the future for artists is to find 1,000 people that love what that artist does, whether you're a musician or a comic book artist or an author or whatever. 1,000 people that will pay money for everything that you produce. And if you can find that 1,000 people and say, listen, you pay me $10 a month and everything that I produce you will get, whether it's a podcast or a new album every year or a comic book or whatever it is. I'm producing it for you. It's a patron model. And there's 120 grand a year and you get to do what you love for a living and you're supported by your audience. Now, I think all of us can find 1,000 listeners. All podcasters should be able to find 1,000 listeners that are willing to pay them $10 a month for their shows. So I tested that model with our shows a couple of years ago and found that it worked. We were able to find a hardcore audience that are willing to pay money for the content that we produce because they like our style, they like our content, they like our sense of humor. And they're our community, they're our hardcore fan base. And I think that is the easiest and quickest path to making money for most podcasts today. And if you can make money on advertising outside of that, I think you look at that as cream.
How have you marketed your podcasts? Do you have a budget for advertising? Or if so, how do you advertise? How do you get the word out?
I think marketing your podcast is something that most podcasters don't put enough thought into. The first show that we kicked off when I sort of rebooted TPN 3 or 4 years ago, the Life of Caesar show, was completely free. And the idea there was to build up the largest audience we could possibly get, and then that would form the basis of our marketing for our premium series that came later. In terms of marketing the Caesar show, I experimented with a variety of different things, Facebook ads, Google ads. I've advertised in podcast magazines, but none of that really delivered any results that were worth mentioning. What we decided early on is that the best place to pick up new listeners is the iTunes podcast directory. You want to get coverage as much as you can in the new and noteworthy section of iTunes. How to get into that is still a bit of a black box mystery. But I also decided that one of the most important things was the star rating that the podcast had in iTunes and the number of positive reviews that it had in iTunes. Now, typically most people on a podcast will say, hey, if you like the show, go up and give us a rating. We decided to take it one step further very early on. We said, go up and give us a rating and write us a review. And if we like your review, if it's funny, we will read it out on the show and we will send you a thank you gift, which is usually a coffee mug with our show logo artwork on there and a funny one-liner. So we've been investing a couple of $100 a month, but we're investing it in getting people to write reviews. And, we also ask them to promote it via Facebook and social media, and that's great. But I think the best thing that we did was create an incentive for our audience to actually go to the effort of taking 5 minutes out of their day to go and leave us a review on iTunes. I think that's the best form of advertising.
That's Cameron Reilly, co-founder of the Podcast Network. He's written an ebook with very handy and practical tips on how to make money from podcasting. It's called simply Making Money from Podcasting. For more information, visit thepodcastnetwork.com.
It's interesting what Cameron was saying about advertising, and advertising really is what most of the discussion around podcasting is centred around these days. And he says it's not about getting X amount of dollars per 1,000 listeners like most agencies are currently offering. And he talks about that global reach, that a podcast in Australia might have most of its listeners in the US, in which case sometimes that the advertising spend can be fractured. So,
well, if I can jump in, that you hear that you need tens of thousands of listens or downloads to start to make some serious money. And Cameron Reilly is doing that. He's got these numbers, but he's not making the money from advertising. So there's a furphy going on there in the advertising world with podcasts on how to make the money, and it's not working.
And it's something which our next guests from Mysterious Universe have also encountered along their journey.
That's right. The free plus premium model of podcasting is something which co-presenters Ben Grundy and Aaron Wright have embraced. The free version of their Mysterious Universe podcast commands a dizzying number of downloads. But it's the paid subscribers to their premium podcast which has allowed them both to work full-time on their passion. At $9 a month, listeners get a whole lot more of the highly entertaining weekly show on the topic of weird and wonderful phenomena happening in this and other worlds. Ben and Aaron tried all kinds of ways to get exposure over the years, including paid advertising, which, as they explain in a moment, wasn't successful. First, I ask Aaron Wright, how many listeners do they enjoy now?
It was just under 1 million downloads per month last month, Ben.
Yeah, we're approaching that magical 7-figure number for downloads. And it's quite amazing the transformation we've had just in the last 12 months. We go through these periods of snowballing with numbers, and we're still trying to figure out where all these new listeners are coming from.
We might have just hit that critical mass where that word of mouth is actually getting to a point where it is allowing, I guess, because we don't do any promotion. We don't do any active promotion. Yes, we use our articles as a way to advertise because people will come to the site. But outside of that, we've found that any type of advertising isn't that effective.
So you've done paid advertising in the past, but you don't now?
No, we've done a whole heap of things. We've used, I think we advertised on Whitley Strieber's podcast a couple of times, which was fine. He was good. But
yeah, Google ads we've tried, other podcasts we've tried, magazine inserts. But honestly, word of mouth and just getting in podcast directories, being spread on social media, those things always trump advertising in our experience. So we decided to, instead of spend the money on advertising, we use those funds to pay our writers to write new content for our site, which increases our SEO in Google. People can find us very easily. Most things that you search for in our genre, whether it's something odd or paranormal, a Mysterious Universe article will be on the front page. And I feel like that has been a way better investment than advertising.
Was it easier in the beginning than it is today because there were just fewer podcasts to compete with?
That's a really great question. I feel like we are fortunate that we started when we did because you're absolutely right. There were less podcasts around. The medium was very, very new. And just in general, it was quite a technical hurdle just to get a podcast working. I remember using desktop apps to kind of hard code the RSS feed way back when I first started. It was that hands-on. So I think you're correct. We got our timing right. We came in at the right time. I don't know if we started again from scratch, if we would have the same ease of success that we did, back in 2007 when I first started.
And those numbers, 1 million downloads a month, which is phenomenal, they're obviously not all coming from Australia. I would suspect that most of your listeners are from the United States. Is that right?
They are, 80% at least, 85%.
Yeah, it goes 80% US, and I think Canada's the next on the list.
Then the UK.
Then the UK.
Then Latvia.
Then Latvia, yeah, that's right. Then Bulgaria, and then right at the bottom is Australia.
Yeah.
I think Australia is fourth on the list.
Why is that? Obviously, America's a much bigger population, but do you target an American audience? Is that your intention?
No, but I certainly think that Australians are exotic to Americans. So I think that plays into part of our success. And on top of that, I just don't think the medium of podcasting has taken off that well in Australia. People don't know a lot about it. Even now, it's still just only starting to take off. And I think that's the big difference.
If we can turn to monetisation, you have a free podcast, but you also have a premium podcast. Is that where most of the income comes from?
Yeah, it is, and it has been for a long time. Recently Ben and I were at a podcasting conference in Chicago, and it was kind of fascinating to us to see this push for advertising. And the problem is that there seems to be this idea that podcasting is radio. It's not radio. It's never going to be. It never has been. It's a completely different medium. The similarities are that only two people are sitting, or more, but are sitting in front of a mic. What it comes down to is that I say to Ben, I feel like sometimes I'm taking crazy pills when we talk about monetizing podcasts, because what you do is you produce a service and people have the option to pay for it. They exchange money for that service. And that's the way that you make money. This is why there are no huge public radio stars when it comes to, they're not multi-million-dollar salaries, because it's not about spreading it out and getting, this advertising revenue. It doesn't exist.
If I can just add to what Aaron's saying, you've got our numbers. I mean, we're close to hitting 1 million downloads a month now, and we have advertising every single episode. If we tried to live off our advertising revenue alone, it wouldn't be possible. It's not even close.
No.
The only way we've been able to run a business is from subscription payments. And I think Aaron's absolutely correct, is that this is a strategy that is being missed by the industry for what I don't know the reason, though. Maybe it's a technical thing. Maybe it's just the way that people think they'll be successful.
Can I add to that as well? It's this whole concept of people thinking how successful they're going to be. There's this feeling I get because we have people that email us in saying, hey guys, I'm starting a podcast. My favorite one is that, it's exactly like your podcast, only funny. Can you promote it for us? I'm not kidding. You get these people that do this. And the thing is, I think people should be trying to create podcasts and going out there and doing it, but don't have this expectation that you're going to be an instant success. Don't have an expectation that you're going to have that 1,000 subscribers within the first 3 weeks of putting your podcast out there, because it doesn't exist. It's this slow and steady and regular put out of content, which is what starts getting you subscribers. Once you've hit a certain mass there, then start offering a service, and you'll find that people will just steadily grow. And that's what's happened for us. I mean, Ben, when you and I started, I think we were making $21,000 a year.
Yeah.
Just nothing. And we
We
scraped by. We lived off our partners, and we did what we could to create this business.
But you still spend a fair amount of time producing a free podcast with advertising. Is that done simply to channel people into the premium service?
Well, I mean, we've tossed around with the idea of just doing content behind a paywall, but ultimately we feel like we would never expand unless we had free content. I think the freemium model, to use that term, is the best way to go, because you're giving yourself full exposure, you're allowing people to sample your product, and if you do a good free product, then people are going to pay for your premium product. And I just can't see it working any other way. I mean, that's actually some podcasts that I subscribe to that are just behind a paywall. But I even hear the hosts on those shows questioning whether their model is good enough, because when they do a great show, say they've got 1,000 subscribers, only 1,000 people hear it. If they do something amazing, only 1,000 people hear it. If we do something that just happens to be great one week, it goes out to all those people, and then it might get spread freely on YouTube, or people might tweet it out, or it goes on Facebook, and then you've got all these people coming to see what you're selling.
And those that want more, well, then pay for it.
Do you think you'll continue with the same system, or do you think it'll change?
It's worked up until now, so I don't see any reason to change that for the moment.
Especially in the last 12 months, we've seen a huge growth in our downloads for the free show. So I feel like there's even more exponential gains just around the corner. It's only really been in the last 18 to 12 months that we've seen our advertising pick up to a point where it's a significant blip on our, monthly revenue.
Let me add, though, I think it's vitally important when it comes to charging for your podcast and making money out of it. It's like any business. You've got to put a lot of that money back into the company. This is how Ben and I have managed to try and stay ahead of the curve, because there's so many podcasts out there, paranormal podcasts and whatever, that are competitors. And, yes, people come to listen to you, but they also come to listen to the content and what you're putting out. And the only way that I think we've managed to do that is by having cutting-edge apps, making it easy, making it colourful, making it professional. that has allowed us to keep going. But unfortunately, that costs money. It costs a huge amount of money. Even recently, our latest update has cost us thousands. So sometimes we have to go without to put the money back into the company, but ultimately we just hope that will have a greater reward for us in the future.
Now, what do you see as the future of podcasting in general, and what's the difference between, say, the US and Australia at the moment?
I feel like the industry's going in the right directions. It's becoming more professional. There's more money being involved in the industry, especially in the United States. People are starting to take notice. More people are listening to podcasts. And the barrier to entry is getting smaller and smaller. So we had a discussion off air about how we maintain our own system versus using a third party. We purely do that because when we started, those options weren't available. Now there's companies offering, whether it's SoundCloud offering podcasting integration or other services allowing you to charge in certain ways or incorporate advertising. I feel like we're on the cusp of it going from what is more a hobbyist's industry to a really professional industry.
I think it's going to take a while, though. I mean, when we were in Chicago just last year at this podcasting convention, it was abundantly clear that the industry is still in its infancy. And there's going to need to be, while you're right, Ben, it is moving towards a more professional outlook. Even now, if I meet someone new and they ask, what do you do? And you say, you're a podcaster, the standard response is, oh, but what do you really do? So there's not a lot of respect there for an understanding that this is a real job.
I notice how I've got the positive view and you're negative. It's all yin and yang. But the thing I will add a caveat to that, I think there's also a danger that as the industry grows bigger and we have more money coming in and larger corporations, I guess, controlling how the content is released, you can get into situations where I think YouTube's a really good example, where you have a platform that is used by millions of people and you have breakouts where people are very successful. The issue they have is that they're now beholden to YouTube. And if YouTube changes an algorithm, if YouTube changes the way that the person's videos are displayed, if they rely on YouTube, if that content creator relies on YouTube for their income, those changes can have serious effects on their business or their livelihood. So we're fortunate that we're not in that situation with podcasting, and I don't think podcasting has that problem yet. But I can see it happening. I could see that becoming a problem in the future where as companies, I mean, if Apple decided to do something with podcasting in a more professional way, I think they could start doing that as well, where you're now beholden to the whims of giant conglomerates in Silicon Valley.
That's Ben Grundy and Aaron Wright. For more on Mysterious Universe and to listen to their weekly podcast, go to mysteriousuniverse.org.
One thing our interviewees agreed on today was the importance of the marketing of a podcast. There are now 360,000 podcasts, so standing out is only going to become more challenging. But as Ben said, creating great content will help it get shared on social media, and at the same time, those audiences will also be growing in podcast directories like the iTunes podcast app. The opportunities to grow untapped audiences through new channels like podcast directories is huge. And speaking of podcast directories and platforms, there are a number of companies popping up to help podcasters gain exposure for their podcast. And next episode, we talk to one of them.
That's right, Nick. Next episode, we hear from Corey Layton of Australian podcast platform Whooshka and his thoughts on how the podcasting landscape is really exciting in Australia right now.
12% of the Australian population listen to podcasts. It's said that by the end of this year, that'll get up to 39%. When you dig into that a bit deeper, that means 39% will have listened to a podcast across the year. But for those people that do, they're consuming large amounts, over 3 hours a week. So it just goes to show that once you're in, you're very much in.
That's Corey Layton, Content and Marketing Director at Whooshka. And we chat with Sophie Kneebone, one of the judges of the recent Castaway Awards, on her thoughts about what makes a good podcast and why it's so engaging if done well.
And so that you don't miss out on their interviews, why not subscribe to Be Podcasting in iTunes? And if you found this valuable, we'd love you to leave a review. That ends episode 3 of Be Podcasting. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at B Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.